A hungry little girl in the snow was protecting two newborn twin babies with a blanket in front of a busy restaurant, until a billionaire walked by and, getting closer, froze at what he saw. Night fell over the city like a heavy cloak, bringing with it a snowstorm that transformed the streets into a white, silent maze. Snowflakes danced in the air, driven by icy gusts of wind that cut like invisible blades. Amid this wintry backdrop, a surreal scene was unfolding outside a bustling restaurant, an image that went unnoticed by most of the hurried passers-by. Anne, only 6 years old, remained still like a tiny statue on the snow-covered sidewalk. Her large, determined eyes scanned the crowd rushing by, searching for what? Help? Compassion? Or perhaps just a glance that would acknowledge her existence. Her frail arms wrapped around a precious bundle, her newly born twin siblings, so small and delicate they seemed almost unreal. The contrast was heartbreaking. The girl, with a gaze that was both determined and desperate, held the babies swaddled in a single worn blanket. Though the fabric was old, it was surprisingly clean, as if it were the last barrier between the children's innocence and the cruelty of the world around them. Snow fell mercilessly on Anne's narrow shoulders, accumulating in her disheveled hair and tinging her cheeks with a deep red, revealing the biting cold. The temperature had plummeted to dangerous levels, turning every breath into a small cloud of vapor that quickly dissolved in the icy air. Anne was visibly trembling, yet her arms remained firm around that precious bundle. Her eyes, far too mature for her age, watched with a mixture of fear and defiance as people hurried along the sidewalk. It was as if Anne and her siblings were trapped in an invisible bubble, completely detached from the hustle and bustle of the city around them. Men and women bundled in heavy coats hurried by, their faces buried in scarves and upturned collars, utterly indifferent to the silent drama unfolding just inches away. Harried executives checked their watches, couples laughed as they stepped into the heated restaurant, and groups of friends animatedly discussed their evening plans. No one seemed to notice the little girl and her precious bundles, as though they were truly invisible on the urban landscape. Suddenly, the roar of a powerful engine cut through the icy air, momentarily overwhelming the constant murmur of the city. A luxurious car, its sleek black paint contrasting dramatically with the whiteness of the snow, halted abruptly near the curb. The vehicle was a masterpiece of automotive engineering, a moving symbol of wealth and status that seemed oddly out of place in that scene of silent despair. The driver's door opened, and Paul Dumont emerged from the car's heated interior. He was the embodiment of corporate success, tall, well-dressed, in a tailored suit that practically shouted money and power. His eyes, usually cold and calculating, scanned the scene before him with the quick efficiency of someone used to assessing situations instantly. Then it happened. Paul's gaze, trained to read spreadsheets and charts, fell upon Anne's tiny figure. For a moment, it was as if the world had stopped spinning. The successful businessman, known for his icy demeanor and his ability to make tough decisions without blinking, was completely paralyzed. His eyes, wide with surprise and shock, fixed on the tiny bundles in the girl's arms. The premature twins, so fragile and small, were almost imperceptible beneath the blanket. But for Paul, in that instant, they were the only thing in the world that mattered. The sight hit him like a punch in the stomach, knocking the wind out of him and making his heart race in a way he had never experienced. Time seemed frozen, just like the snowflakes dancing in the air around them. Paul stood motionless, unable to move or look away. It was as if an invisible force held him in place, forcing him to witness a reality he had always known existed, but had never truly acknowledged. Anne's eyes met Paul's, and it was as if an electric current passed between them. The girl's gaze, a disconcerting mix of fierce determination and palpable desperation, pierced Paul's soul. In that look, he saw a strength that defied his understanding, a child shouldering a burden that would make many adults give up. The contrast between Paul's ostentatious wealth, shown by his luxury car and expensive suit, and the children's dire situation, was striking. It was a cruel juxtaposition of the inequality that pervaded the city, a vivid and painful reminder of disparities just a few feet apart. Paul felt a wave of shame and guilt wash over him, emotions he was unaccustomed to dealing with. Slowly, As though moving through a dream, or perhaps a nightmare, Paul approached. Each step was cautious, measured, as if he feared that one sudden movement might make the scene before him vanish like a mirage. The snow squeaked under his expensive Italian shoes, a sound that seemed oddly loud in the tense silence that had set in. Instinctively, Anne drew back protectively. Her small arms clutched the blanket holding the twins to her chest, as though afraid this well-dressed stranger might snatch them from her. Her eyes, though exhausted, sparkled with a mix of fear and defiance. It was the gaze of someone who had already faced more adversity than any child ever should. Then it happened. A weak, almost inaudible cry escaped from the bundle in Anne's arms. The sound was so frail, so desperate, that it seemed to cut through the icy air like a knife. Paul felt his heart clench in a way he had never felt before. The babies, visibly weakened by the cold hand, were fighting for each breath. Their tiny lives hung by a thread, and suddenly, Paul found himself the only hope they had. "It's all right," Paul murmured, surprised by the softness of his own voice. The words came out almost without his realizing it, an automatic reflex of compassion he hadn't known he possessed. Even as he spoke, Paul realized how inadequate and insufficient his words felt in the face of such desperation. What could he possibly say or do that would truly make a difference at this moment? "I want to help," he continued, his voice gaining a bit more firmness. "I won't separate you, I promise." The words were charged with a sincerity that even surprised Paul himself. In his years in the business world, he had made countless promises, but none seemed as important, as vital as this one. Anne hesitated, her eyes, far older and wiser than her 6 years, flicking between Paul and the busy street. The distrust was palpable, an invisible wall built by experiences Paul could only imagine. But there was something else in her look, something that made Paul's heart tighten even more. It was a spark of desperate hope, a silent plea for help she hardly dared to express. "Hospital," Paul said simply, pointing to the car. His mind, normally occupied with numbers, business strategies, and future planning, could now only focus on one thing: the urgent need to save those tiny lives that fate had placed in his path. The seconds that followed felt like an eternity. The world around them carried on. Cars drove by, people entered and exited the restaurant, and the snow continued to fall relentlessly. But for Paul and Anne, it was as if time had stopped. All of existence was condensed into this moment, this decision. Anne, still hesitant, looked down at the siblings in her arms. Paul could see the turmoil in her eyes, the fear of the unknown, battling the desperate need for help. She looked back at Paul, her eyes searching his for any sign of deceit or ill intention. Finally, her gaze shifted to the car, warm and inviting, a refuge from the cruel cold of the night. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Anne nodded. It was such a subtle movement that, had Paul not been focused entirely on her, he might have missed it. But to him, in that moment, it was as though the whole world had changed with that simple gesture, with a care that surprised even himself. Paul opened the car door. The warmth inside rushed out immediately, forming a cloud of vapor in the freezing air. The contrast between the vehicle's luxurious and comfortable interior and the cold, harsh reality of the street was staggering. Paul found himself wondering how long it had been since Anne or the babies had felt any warmth or comfort. Anne approached the car slowly, as though afraid it would vanish if she moved too quickly. Her eyes never left the precious bundles in her arms, even as she began to climb into the vehicle. Paul watched, his heart aching, as the girl carefully settled into the back seat, still clutching the twins tightly. It was a heartbreaking sight, a small, dirty, exhausted child sitting on a plush leather seat. Her tangled hair and worn clothes stood out sharply against the car's immaculate interior. But what most drew Paul's attention were Anne's eyes, watchful, distrustful, never leaving her precious bundles or losing sight of Paul. Paul closed the door gently, fearing any sudden noise might startle Anne. He circled around the car and slipped into the driver's seat, his movements slow and deliberate. When he started the engine, the luxurious car's quiet purr sounded deafening in the tense silence that had settled inside. The car sped off, cutting through the frosty night toward the hospital. Inside, The silence was almost tangible. Paul glanced in the rearview mirror every few seconds to see Anne trembling in the back seat. He realized it wasn't just the physical cold that made her shake. It was fear, exhaustion, and a complex mix of emotions he could scarcely begin to understand. The babies, so quiet and still in Anne's arms, seemed too small and fragile for this cruel world. Paul felt a wave of protectiveness and resolve sweep over him. He hardly knew these children, knew almost nothing about their lives or their stories, yet at that moment he felt responsible for them, as though the universe had conspired to place him at exactly the right place, at exactly the right time, to make a difference. The drive to the hospital felt both interminably long and startlingly brief, the snow-covered streets blurred by outside the windows, but inside the car time seemed frozen. Paul found himself making silent promises, to himself, to Anne, to the babies. Promises that everything would be all right, that he would do whatever it took to help. At last, the lights of the hospital appeared ahead, a beacon of hope in the dark night. Paul parked with a sense of urgency he rarely displayed, even in his most critical business deals. Stepping out of the car, they were met by a flurry of movement and sound after the tense silence of the drive. The doors had barely opened when a medical team, alerted by a rushed phone call Paul had made en route, descended on them. Nurses and doctors, dressed in white coats, looked like angels against the dark backdrop of the snowy night. Their calm but urgent voices cut through the cold air. "Where are the babies? How long have they been exposed to the cold? Any sign of hypothermia?" The questions came quickly and precisely, a surge of professional concern that starkly contrasted with the indifference Anne had faced on the streets. The twins were swiftly but gently taken from Anne's reluctant arms. The girl, who until then had shown such strength and determination, let out a small sound of protest, her arms still outstretched as if unwilling to let go of her precious burden. Paul felt his heart clench at the look of loss and fear on the child's face. In seconds, the babies were placed in transport incubators and rushed to the neonatal ICU. The hospital corridor filled with the sound of rolling wheels and urgent voices discussing treatments and procedures. And then, as quickly as it started, everything went quiet again. Anne stood in the middle of the hospital lobby, her arms suddenly feeling too heavy now that they were empty. Her large, frightened eyes followed the route the doctors had taken with her siblings. It was as if a part of her had been ripped away, leaving her incomplete and vulnerable. Paul, who until then had felt like a bystander in his own life, suddenly realized he was now Anne's sole anchor in this strange and frightening world. He approached her slowly, unsure of how to comfort a child who had clearly learned not to trust adults. That was when, in a moment of absolute vulnerability, the words escaped Anne's trembling lips. "Mommy, she died after they were born." The revelation hit Paul like a lightning bolt. The gravity of the situation, already immense, gained a new and devastating dimension. He looked at Anne and truly saw her for the first time. She wasn't just a girl caring for babies. She was an orphan, carrying a burden no child should bear. The successful businessman, accustomed to corporate crises and high-stakes negotiations, felt utterly unprepared for this situation. Words failed him, and for a moment all he could do was stand beside Anne, silently sharing her pain. While the doctors fought to stabilize the premature twins in the neonatal ICU, Paul made a decision that would forever change the course of their lives. With a voice that brooked no argument, he addressed the medical team approaching for more information. "I'll pay for everything, whatever it costs. Do whatever is necessary to save these children." The words came out with a conviction that surprised even Paul. Throughout his years in business, he had made countless important decisions, but none felt as crucial as this. The hours that followed were a blur of frenzied activity. Doctors and nurses rushed back and forth, monitors beeped, and the air was charged with tension. Paul remained at Anne's side, a silent but comforting presence. He watched helplessly as the girl fought against exhaustion, determined to stay awake until she had news of her siblings. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a doctor approached them. His face was serious, but there was a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "The babies are stable for now," he reported, "but the next 24 hours will be critical. They're very premature and were exposed to the cold for too long. We're doing everything we can. Paul nodded, thanking the doctor. He turned to Anne, preparing to translate the information in a way a 6-year-old might understand. But to his surprise, Anne was already looking at him, her eyes filled with a comprehension far beyond her years. "They're going to be okay," Anne said, her voice small but firm. "They have to be." The conviction in the girl's voice touched Paul deeply. He knelt beside her, meeting her gaze. "Yes, they will be," he agreed, surprised by the certainty in his own voice. "And I promise I'll do everything I can to help all 3 of you." Anne studied him for a long moment, as if evaluating the sincerity of his words. Then, slowly, she nodded. Exhaustion finally began to overwhelm Anne's determination. Her eyes started to close, her small body swaying slightly. Acting on instinct, Paul gently picked her up and carried her to a more comfortable chair in the waiting area. Anne, exhausted beyond measure, finally surrendered to sleep. Paul sat there, watching the sleeping girl, his mind a whirl of thoughts and emotions. How could a simple drive have turned into something so monumental? How could he, a man used to dealing in millions of dollars, feel so helpless in the face of 3 children's destiny? As the night wore on and the snow kept falling outside, Paul Dumont kept vigil. His eyes shifted between Anne, asleep in the chair, and the corridor leading to the neonatal ICU, where the twins were fighting for their lives. His life, which just hours before had seemed so defined and controlled, had been turned upside down. And yet, looking at the sleeping Anne and thinking of the tiny fighters in the ICU, he knew there was nowhere else he should be. A strange sensation, part fear, part resolve, began to take hold in him. Paul didn't know what the future held, but he was certain of one thing. These 3 children's lives were now irrevocably linked with his. A story of unlikely encounters, of lives intertwined by fate, and of how a single moment of compassion can change everything. As the sun began to rise, casting the first golden rays over the snow-covered city, Paul prepared to face the challenges the new day would bring. He knew nothing would be easy, but for the first time in a long while, he felt he was doing something truly important. The days unfolded like a kaleidoscope of emotions in the hospital, each bringing new challenges and small victories for Paul Dumont and the unlikely family he had found. The once high-powered businessman, whose life revolved around board meetings and million-dollar contracts, now found himself immersed in a world of heart monitors, incubators, and the relentless struggle of 2 premature babies to survive. Paul had become a constant presence at the hospital, his footsteps echoing through sterile corridors several times a day. Each visit brought a mixture of anxiety and hope, anxiety about the twins' condition, hope of seeing a smile on Anne's tired face. Anne, the 6-year-old girl who carried the weight of the world on her small shoulders, watched Paul's dedication with a blend of curiosity and caution. Her eyes, always alert, far beyond her age, followed his every move, as if continuously assessing his intentions. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after the fateful night their lives became entangled, Paul arrived at the hospital with an idea that had been on his mind for days. "Anne," he began, his voice soft so as not to disturb the almost reverential quiet of the twins' room, "I was thinking, maybe you'd like to come with me to my home for a few hours. We could grab some clean clothes, maybe eat something different from hospital food." He left the sentence hanging, carefully watching the girl's reaction. Anne, seated in her usual chair next to the incubators, remained still for a moment. Her eyes shifted from the babies to Paul and back to the babies. "No," she finally said, her voice quiet but firm. "I can't leave them." Paul's heart ached at the girl's fierce loyalty. "Anne, I'm sure the doctors and nurses will take good care of them for a few hours. You need to rest, have a hot bath." But Anne was already shaking her head before he could finish. "I promised Mommy I'd take care of them. I can't leave." The determination in her voice was unshakable, and Paul realized that pushing her would only make her withdraw further. He nodded, accepting her decision. "All right, I understand. How about if I bring you some things? Then clean clothes, maybe some books, and something yummy to eat." This time, Anne hesitated before answering. Paul could see the conflict in her eyes, the desire to accept help battling the fear of trusting, of depending on someone else. "Okay," she finally agreed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." Paul felt a wave of relief and something else, a warm sensation he couldn't quite name. It was a small step, but a significant one. Anne was slowly beginning to let down her guard. In the following days, Paul became something of a personal supplier for Anne and the twins. He arrived at the hospital laden with bags, soft, comfortable clothes for Anne, colorful blankets for the babies, with the doctor's approval, of course, storybooks, and home-cooked meals he ordered from the best restaurants in town. Gradually, Anne began to accept these small luxuries. Paul took satisfaction in seeing how her eyes lit up when he brought her favorite dish, or how she gently stroked the new blankets for the twins. It was on one of those nights, as Paul settled in for yet another vigil on the room's uncomfortable couch, that Anne began to open up. "You know," she said softly, her eyes fixed on the sleeping twins, "Mum used to sing to us every night." Paul sat up, paying close attention. It was rare for Anne to talk about her mother, and he hung on every word like a thirsty traveler in the desert. "Really?" he asked gently, encouraging her to continue. Anne nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Yeah." She had a beautiful voice. Even when we were cold or hungry, her voice made everything seem better. Paul felt a lump in his throat. He pictured a woman softly singing to her children in a cold, empty room, and it struck him hard. "She sounds like a wonderful mother," he said quietly. Anne agreed, her eyes shining with tears she wouldn't shed. She always said that one day we'd have a big house, with a bedroom for each of us." Paul absorbed this, feeling the weight of the responsibility he had assumed growing heavier. He wasn't just helping save 3 lives, he was fulfilling the dream of an entire family. The days turned into weeks, and with them came the first significant signs of improvement in the twins' condition. Each small victory was cause for celebration. The first day off respiratory support, the first reflexive suck, the first strong, healthy cry. Paul found himself celebrating each milestone with surprising enthusiasm. He, who once measured success in terms of profits and stock shares, was now elated when a baby gained a single ounce. It was during one of these small celebrations that it happened. Anne smiled at Paul for the first time. It wasn't a large, exuberant smile, but a small curve of her lips, a sparkle in her eyes that made Paul's heart leap. In that moment, he knew there was no turning back. These children had become part of his life in a way he could never have predicted. As Anne's trust in Paul grew, she began revealing more details about her life before the hospital. Paul listened carefully to each piece of information, trying to piece together the puzzle of this small family's story. "We used to live in a single room," Anne confided one night, while idly playing with the edge of her new blanket. "It was small, but Mum always said it was our castle." Paul felt his heart clench. One room, a single room for an entire family. The reality of the poverty Anne and her family had faced struck him with renewed force. "That must have been hard," he commented softly. Anne shrugged, an oddly grown-up gesture for someone so young. "Sometimes, but Mum always made it feel like an adventure. She said we were like explorers in a secret cave." Paul smiled at the image, admiring the creativity and love of a mother he would never meet. "She sounds like a very special person." "She was," Anne agreed, her voice tinged with longing. "She worked a lot, you know? Sometimes she had 2 or 3 jobs at once. But she always found time to play with me and tell stories." Paul nodded, feeling a mix of admiration and sadness. He couldn't help wondering what life would be like if this remarkable woman were still alive. How would she react to him, a stranger who had unexpectedly stepped into her children's lives? As the days passed, Paul found himself increasingly invested not just in the physical well-being of the children, but also in their future. He began to make plans, to imagine how he could help not only Anne and the twins, but other families in similar situations. One morning, while having coffee in the hospital cafeteria, Paul had an idea. He picked up his phone and made a quick call to his assistant. "Mark," he said as soon as the call connected, "I need you to do some research for me. I want information on assistance programs for low-income families in our city, especially those focused on housing and childcare." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Paul could picture the surprised look on his assistant's face. This wasn't the kind of request Paul Dumont usually made. "Of course, Mr. Dumont," Mark finally replied. "Should I focus on any specific area of the city?" Paul hesitated, thinking of the single room Anne had mentioned. "Start with the poorest areas. I want a complete report by the end of the week." After hanging up, Paul sat for a moment, contemplating what he had just set in motion. He was about to dive into an entirely new world, one of social problems and challenges he barely understood. But thinking of Anne and the twins, he knew he was doing the right thing. When he returned to the twins' room, Paul found Anne awake and alert, her eyes fixed on the tiny bodies in the incubators. "They're stronger today," she said without taking her eyes off the babies. "The nurse said they might be able to breathe on their own soon." Paul felt relief and joy flood him. "That's wonderful, Anne. They're true fighters, just like you." Anne turned to him then, her eyes shining with a mix of pride and concern. Do you think they'll be okay?" The vulnerability in her voice made Paul's heart ache. For a moment, he saw not the strong and determined little girl who faced the world with unfathomable courage, but a frightened child who just wanted her family safe and together. "I believe they will," he answered, mustering all the conviction he could. "They have the best doctors caring for them, and they have you. And now they have me too." The words slipped out before he could think, but the moment he said them, Paul realized they were true. He was committed to these children, their well-being and their future, in a way he had never been committed to anything before. Anne studied him for a long moment, her wise eyes probing his, as though searching for the truth behind his words. At last, she nodded, as though reaching a decision. "Okay," she said simply. In that single word, Paul sensed something fundamental had changed. Anne was finally starting to trust him. The days that followed brought a comfortable routine. Paul divided his time between the hospital and his office, where he immersed himself in research on social programs and charitable initiatives. He began to see his wealth and influence in a new light, not just as symbols of personal success, but as tools that could be used to make a real difference in people's lives. One evening, as Paul sat beside Anne reading aloud from one of the storybooks he had brought, one of the twins, the boy, opened his eyes and focused on them. "Look," Anne exclaimed, her voice filled with excitement and fear. "He's looking at us." Paul felt his heart race. The baby's eyes, still a bit unfocused, looked huge in his pale little face. For a moment, Paul had the uncanny feeling the baby was really seeing him, recognizing him. "Hello, little one," he murmured softly. "Welcome to the world." Anne leaned closer to the incubator, tears shining in her eyes. "He's beautiful, isn't he?" Paul nodded, unable to speak for a moment. The fragility and beauty of life had never been clearer to him than at that moment. "Yes," he finally managed to say, "he's perfect." That night, after Anne finally fell asleep, exhausted but happy, Paul stayed awake for hours, watching the twins. He found himself imagining their future. Where would they live? What kind of education would they receive? Who would take care of them once they left the hospital? The questions spun in his mind, each bringing new concerns and new plans. Paul realized he was thinking not just about the children's immediate future, but years down the line. He pictured first days of school, birthdays, graduations. It was then that Paul Dumont, the man who once measured success in numbers and contracts, realized his life had changed irrevocably. He was no longer just a successful businessman who happened to help a few needy children. He was becoming something more, a guardian, perhaps, or something even deeper. With this realization came a sense of peace Paul hadn't felt in years. He looked at Anne sleeping in her uncomfortable chair and at the twins in their incubators. These were his purpose now, he realized. Not contracts or mergers or acquisitions, but these 3 precious lives that fate had placed in his path. As the sun rose, casting a golden light over the hospital room, Paul knew his life would never be the same, and for the first time in a long while, he was genuinely excited to see what the future held. He made a silent promise in that moment, not just to the sleeping children, but to himself. He would do everything in his power to ensure that Anne and the twins would have the life their mother had always dreamed of for them. A big house, individual bedrooms, a yard full of flowers, and most importantly, a united, loving family. Paul Dumont, the man who once lived solely for business, now had a new purpose, and he was determined not to fail. Night fell over the city, draping the hospital in a blanket of stillness. In the neonatal ICU room, Paul Dumont sat in his usual chair, his eyes fixed on the two small incubators housing the twins. The steady beeping of heart monitors was the only sound breaking the silence, a constant reminder of the fragility and strength of these tiny lives. As he watched the slight rise and fall of the babies' chests, Paul found himself lost in profound reflections about his own life. Just a few weeks ago, his world revolved around board meetings, million-dollar contracts, and the relentless pursuit of the next big deal. Now, here he was, spending his nights in a hospital, wholly absorbed in the struggle for survival of two babies who, until recently, were strangers to him. "What are you thinking about?" Anne's gentle voice pulled him out of his reverie. The girl was curled up in her own chair, her eyes tired but attentive, fixed on Paul. He smiled softly at her. "I'm thinking about how quickly life can change," he answered honestly. "A month ago, I didn't know you existed. And now, well, now I can't imagine my life without you." Anne nodded, as though she fully understood what he meant. "Mommy always said life is full of surprises, some good, some bad, but all important." Paul felt a wave of admiration for the wisdom of a woman he'd never met. "Your mom sounds like she was a very wise person," he remarked. "Could you tell me more about her? What your life was like together?" Anne's eyes lit up with the memory. "Oh, it was wonderful," she began, her voice brimming with longing and love. "We didn't have much, you know? Sometimes dinner was just bread with butter, but Mommy always made it feel like a feast." She paused, a small smile playing on her lips. "I remember one time on my birthday, Mommy didn't have money for a cake, so she took slices of bread, cut them into a cake shape, and stuck a candle on top. We sang Happy Birthday, and it was the best birthday I ever had." Paul felt a knot form in his throat, the image of a mother doing her best to bring joy into her child's life, even amid poverty, moved him deeply. He glanced at the twins, fighting each day to live, and felt a wave of compassion wash over him. "You were happy," he said softly, not really asking a question. Anne nodded emphatically. "Very. Mom always said we didn't need things, we just needed each other." Anne's words echoed in Paul's mind, making him question everything he had ever valued. The social inequalities he had always seen but never really noticed now seemed glaring. How could it be that in a city where he lived in a mansion and drove luxury cars, there were families living in a single room, making birthday cakes out of bread? His thoughts were interrupted by a small movement in one of the incubators. The baby, the girl, was stirring, her tiny fingers opening and closing as though searching for something to hold. Without thinking, Paul stood up and approached. "May I?" he asked Anne, indicating the small opening in the incubator. Anne nodded, her eyes wide with curiosity. Carefully, Paul slipped his hand into the incubator. His heart nearly stopped when he felt the baby's minuscule fingers close around his. It was a surprisingly strong grip for someone so small and frail. "Hello, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You really are a fighter, aren't you?" Anne watched the scene with a mix of emotion and wonder. She had never seen an adult, especially a man like Paul, show such tenderness. Something inside her began to shift, a seed of trust taking root. The following days brought subtle but significant changes. The twins showed consistent signs of improvement. Their weight steadily increased, their reflexes grew stronger, and the doctors spoke with growing optimism about their chances. Paul, in turn, spent more and more time at the hospital. When he wasn't with Anne and the twins, he could be found in an improvised conference room, conducting business meetings by video call. Anne observed these interactions curiously, noticing how Paul seemed different, kinder, more patient than the businessman she had first met. One afternoon, after wrapping up a particularly long call, Paul turned to Anne with a thoughtful look. "Anne," he began hesitantly, "do you think the people who work for me are happy?" The question caught Anne off guard. She frowned, thinking it over. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "But Mommy always said a good boss is someone who cares about people." not just money. Anne's words hit Paul like lightning. He found himself rethinking every decision he'd ever made at his company. How many times had he prioritized profits over his employees' well-being? How many families might be going through similar hardships to those Anne and her mother had faced? As these profound reflections occupied Paul's mind, the twins continued their recovery. Each little milestone was cause for celebration. The first day, both babies opened their eyes at the same time. The first proper bath, the first time they managed to take a little milk from a bottle, each moment was greeted with tears of joy and emotional embraces. Paul was surprised at the intensity of his own reactions. Once proud of his ability to remain composed in any situation, he now found himself openly weeping with happiness when one of the twins grabbed his finger with renewed strength. Anne watched these changes in Paul with growing admiration. The man she initially saw as a distant, wealthy stranger was becoming a constant, comforting presence in her life. She began to trust him, to seek his comfort in difficult moments, and to share her joy during the good ones. One night, while the three of them, Paul, Anne, and the twins, now out of the incubators, were gathered in the hospital room, Anne asked a question that caught Paul off guard. "Paul," she began timidly, "do you think you could teach me to read better? Mommy started teaching me, but..." Her voice faltered, the pain of loss still fresh. Paul felt his heart clench. "Of course, Anne," he replied gently. "I'd love to teach you." In the days that followed, between caring for the babies and fielding business calls, Paul and Anne could be found poring over magazines and newspapers in the waiting area. Paul patiently guided Anne through words, explaining sounds and meanings, celebrating every small improvement. It was during one of these reading sessions that Anne shared more about the difficulties her family had faced. "You know," she said, pointing to a grocery store flyer in the magazine, "Mommy always looked at these ads to see where things were cheapest. Sometimes we'd walk for hours just to save a few cents on milk or bread." Paul listened intently, his heart heavy with the reality of the daily struggles so many families faced. He found himself doing mental calculations. How much would it cost to ensure that no family in his city had to walk for hours just to buy food? How much of his personal fortune could he direct toward food assistance programs? As Anne continued to share stories of her life before the hospital, Paul felt a profound change stirring within him. The concerns that once dominated his life, quarterly profits, stock value, corporate acquisitions, seemed insignificant compared to the real struggles people like Anne and her mother faced every day. One afternoon, as Paul rocked one of the twins, the boy who had just finished his bottle, he found himself making a silent promise. He would use his resources, his influence, and his knowledge to help not just Anne and the twins, but as many families as possible. Anne, watching Paul with the baby, felt a wave of gratitude and affection. She approached quietly, and for the first time since they met, gave Paul a spontaneous hug. Surprised but deeply moved, Paul wrapped his free arm around Anne, holding both children, one in each arm, close to his heart. In that moment, he knew his life would never be the same, and for the first time in a very long while, he was truly happy about it. Paul Dumont's awakening to the realities of the world around him and the transformative power of love and compassion had only just begun. As the sun set outside the hospital window, casting a golden glow over the room, Paul knew he stood on the threshold of a new journey, a journey of discovery, growth, and above all, love. The morning sun filtered through the hospital windows, lighting up the room where Paul, Annie, and the twins had spent the past few weeks. Paul watched Anne, who slept curled up in a makeshift armchair, her small body finally giving in to exhaustion after yet another night of vigil. He couldn't help but admire the strength and resilience of this 6-year-old girl. From the moment their paths crossed on that cold night, Anne had unwittingly taught Paul lessons no MBA or leadership course could ever provide. Her ability to hold on to hope in the face of adversity, her unconditional love for her siblings, and her quiet strength were a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Paul found himself reflecting on how drastically his perspective on life and family had changed in recent weeks. Success had once meant lucrative contracts and corporate acquisitions. Now, success meant seeing a smile on Anne's face when the twins made progress, or feeling the firm grip of a tiny hand on his finger. His thoughts were abruptly interrupted by an alarming sound from one of the monitors. Paul's heart raced as he saw the boy twins' vital signs dropping fast. Within seconds, the room was flooded with medical staff, their urgent voices and swift movements creating an atmosphere of controlled panic. Anne woke with a start at the commotion, her eyes wide with fear as she took in the scene. Paul immediately went to her, wrapping her in his arms as they both watched, helpless, while the doctors worked frantically to stabilize the baby. "What's happening?" Anne whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know, sweetheart," Paul answered honestly, his own voice betraying his fear. "But the doctors are doing everything they can." The hours that followed were a blur of anxiety and fear. The little boy had developed a severe infection, and his small battle for life had begun anew with renewed intensity. Paul and Anne stayed together, united by their shared fear and the fragile hope that everything would be all right. While the doctors fought to contain the infection, Paul found himself doing something he hadn't done in years: praying. Not formal or eloquent prayers, but silent, desperate pleas for this small life to be spared. For the first time in a long while, he experienced what it meant to care so deeply about someone that the very thought of losing them was unbearable. Nights of vigil followed, with Paul and Anne taking turns sitting by the incubator. It was during one of those nights, as Paul watched Anne whisper words of encouragement to her baby brother, that he began to seriously consider how he could use his position and resources to help other families in similar situations. He envisioned hospital wards equipped with the best medical technology, assistance programs for low-income families, and scholarships for gifted children from disadvantaged communities. The possibilities seemed endless, and for the first time, Paul felt his wealth and influence could serve a purpose far greater than simply amassing more wealth. As the days passed and the baby's condition slowly improved, Paul noticed a subtle change in Anne. She seemed quieter, more pensive, her eyes often lost in distant thoughts. One night, while they sat together by the incubator, she finally shared what was on her mind. "Paul," she began softly, Do you think they'll separate us when we leave here?" Paul's heart constricted at the question. He knew it was a real possibility. 3 orphaned children, with no known relatives, could easily be split up by the system. "I'm scared," Anne continued, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "I promised Mommy I'd take care of them. I can't leave them." Paul pulled Anne close and hugging her tightly. "I promise you, Anne," he said with surprising conviction, "I'll do everything in my power to keep you together. You're a family, and families should stay together." The words came out of his mouth before he could consider the implications, but the moment he said them, Paul knew they were true. He would do whatever was necessary to keep these children safe and united. A few days later, Anne surprised Paul by arriving at the hospital with a bundle wrapped in an old scarf. Carefully, she unwrapped it to reveal a worn photo album, its pages yellowed with age. I wanted to show you this," she said shyly. "They're pictures of Mommy." Paul sat beside her, his heart pounding at the chance to finally see the face of the woman who had raised this extraordinary girl and given birth to the twins. As Anne turned the pages, a story of love, sacrifice, and unfulfilled dreams unfolded before Paul's eyes. There were pictures of a smiling young woman, her eyes shining with hope and determination. Anne pointed to each photo, sharing stories her mother had told her. "This is Mommy when she graduated from high school," Anne explained, pointing to a picture of a teenager wearing a graduation gown and cap. "She wanted to go to college, you know. She wanted to be a nurse. But she didn't have the money, so she started working to save up." Paul listened, fascinated and moved, as Anne recounted her mother's dreams and sacrifices, how she had worked 3 jobs to save for college, only to spend all her savings when her own mother fell ill. How she never gave up on her dream, even when life threw more obstacles her way. As the pages turned, Paul felt increasingly touched by this family's hardships. Photos of baby Anne, her mother with circles under her eyes but still smiling, pictures of simple birthday celebrations, overflowing with love. Each image told a story of struggle, but also of unconditional love and unwavering hope. Then they reached a photo that made Paul catch his breath. It showed Anne's mother, visibly pregnant with the twins, her face radiant despite the clearly difficult circumstances. The picture had been taken in the small room Anne had mentioned, peeling walls visible in the background. But what most drew Paul's attention was the look on the woman's face, a look of pure joy and hope for the future. At that moment, something shifted inside Paul. Seeing the face of the woman who had given everything for her children, who had faced so many hardships yet still held on to hope, struck him in a way he never expected. Silently, he made a promise, not just to Anne and the twins, but to the memory of this brave mother. He would use every resource he had to help these children, to give them the opportunities their mother had always dreamed of. "Anne," Paul said softly, "your mother was an incredible woman." Anne nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "She was the best," she agreed. Then, carefully, she turned another page of the album. "This is my favorite picture," she said, pointing. The photo showed Anne and her mother, both grinning widely at the camera. They were sitting on a park bench, the autumn sun casting a golden hue over everything. The love between mother and daughter was palpable, even through the photograph. "It was my last birthday with her," Anne explained, her voice tender with remembrance. "She took me to the park and we got ice cream. It was a perfect day." Paul studied the photo, a jumble of emotions swirling inside him. Sadness for Anne's loss, admiration for this family's strength, and a renewed determination to make a difference in these children's lives. "It's a beautiful picture, Anne," he said, placing an arm around the girl's shoulders. "Your mum looks so happy." "She was," Anne affirmed. "She always said that me and the babies were the best thing that ever happened to her." Anne's words hung in the air, heavy with emotion. Paul felt his eyes fill with tears, overwhelmed by the love and sacrifice of a woman he had never met, but whose legacy he now felt responsible to honor. In that moment, gazing at the photo of Anne and her mother smiling in the park, Paul knew his life had changed forever. He was no longer just a successful businessman, but a man on a mission to protect, nurture, and provide a bright future for these 3 children fate had placed in his path. The rest of the afternoon passed with Anne sharing more stories about her mother, each painting a clearer picture of the extraordinary woman she had been. Paul listened intently, asking questions and laughing with Anne at the funny parts. Meanwhile, the twins slept peacefully in their incubators, blissfully unaware of the emotions swirling around them. Paul couldn't help noticing how much stronger they seemed each day, their tiny daily battles a testament to the resilience they had inherited from their mother. As night fell and the hospital lights dimmed, Paul found himself reflecting on everything he had learned that day. The life lessons Anne and her family had taught him were more valuable than anything he had ever gained from his corporate experiences. He thought of Anne's resilience, her mother's unwavering hope, and the twins' daily struggle. All these lessons came together to form a new perspective on what truly mattered in life. Family, love, hope. These were the real treasures, infinitely more precious than any bank account or investment portfolio. As Anne drifted off to sleep, still clutching the photo album, Paul made a silent promise. He would use every resource at his disposal, not just his money, but also his influence and connections, to make sure Anne and the twins had every opportunity their mother had dreamed of for them. More than that, he pledged to use his position to help other families in similar situations. Paul knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be legal, logistical, and emotional challenges to overcome. But looking at Anne asleep and the twins in their incubators, he felt a determination he'd never known before. This was a fight worth fighting, and he was ready to face any obstacle. With one last glance at Anne's favorite photo, her and her mother smiling on that park bench, Paul settled into his chair for another night of vigil. But this time, instead of anxiety or fear, he felt a sense of purpose and hope. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Paul Dumont's life would never be the same, and he was profoundly grateful for that. Morning arrived with a promise of change in the air. After weeks of uncertainty and fear, the moment Paul, as Anne, and the entire medical team had been waiting for finally came. The twins were being discharged from the ICU. Though still frail, the babies were now stable enough to be moved to a regular hospital room. Paul arrived early, carrying colorful balloons and a teddy bear for each baby. His heart pounded with a blend of emotions, joy at the twins' progress, anxiety about the future, and a growing sense of responsibility for these three lives so unexpectedly intertwined with his. Anne was already awake when he entered the room, her eyes bright with a mix of excitement and nerves. "Are they really leaving the ICU today?" she asked, her voice barely containing her anticipation. Paul nodded, smiling broadly. "Yes, Anne. They're ready for the next step." The morning passed in a flurry of activity. Nurses came and went, checking the twins' vitals one last time. Doctors made their final rounds, offering advice and instructions for ongoing care. Paul absorbed every word, determined to ensure the babies got the best care possible. Finally, the moment arrived. With the utmost care, the twins were transferred to their new cribs. Paul and Anne followed anxiously as they were wheeled into their new room, a more welcoming, less clinical space than the ICU. Once they were settled, Paul felt a wave of relief wash over him. Looking at the tiny, delicate faces of the twins, he could scarcely believe how far they had come. From struggling just to breathe, they were now alert infants whose curious eyes took in their new surroundings. Anne stepped beside Paul, her eyes never leaving her siblings. "They look so much bigger now," she said softly. Paul chuckled quietly. "They've grown a lot, haven't they? But they still have a long way to go." As they watched the babies, Paul found himself reflecting on how far they had all come. Not just the twins, who had grown and changed so much in the past weeks, but himself as well. He felt like a different person, transformed by the experience of caring for these children. It was in this moment of reflection that Anne, absently fiddling with the edge of her blanket, made a casual remark that would change everything. "You know," she said, "Mommy used to talk about the place where she worked. I think it was the same company as yours, Paul Dumont Industries, right?" For a moment, Paul's entire world seemed to freeze. He felt as though the air had been sucked out of his lungs. "What?" he managed, his voice barely a whisper. Anne, unaware of the impact of her words, went on. "Yeah, she always said how big and pretty the building was. She liked cleaning the windows because she could see the whole city from up there." Paul felt his legs go weak, and he braced himself against the nearest wall. "Anne," he said, fighting to keep his voice steady, "are you sure about that? Your mom worked at Dumont Industries." Anne nodded, finally noticing Paul's sudden change in demeanor. "Yes, I'm sure. She worked nights, cleaning offices." "Why, is something wrong?" Paul's mind spun. How had he not made the connection before? How many times had he walked past cleaning crews in his building without even noticing their faces? How many Annes had been right under his nose, struggling to survive while he enjoyed luxuries without a second thought? "Anne," Paul said, kneeling to meet the girl's eye level, "could you tell me more about your mom's job? Anything else you remember?" Anne furrowed her brow, clearly puzzled by Paul's sudden interest. "Well, she worked a lot. Sometimes she did overtime to earn a bit more. She always said it was a good job, even though it was tiring." Each word was like a knife to Paul's heart. He remembered all the times he'd cut benefits to maximize profits, all the times he'd denied raises to lower-level workers. How many lives had he affected without even realizing it? Guilt consumed him, mingling with a fierce determination to make things right. In that moment, Paul made a decision that would change not just his life, but the lives of everyone who worked for him. "Anne," he said, his voice trembling slightly, I'm sorry I didn't pay more attention, that I didn't do more to help people like your mother." Anne looked at him, confused. "But you didn't know Mommy, Paul. How could you have helped?" Paul felt tears forming in his eyes. "I should have paid more attention. I should have cared more about the people who worked for me, not just profits." Without thinking, he pulled Anne into a tight hug. "Forgive me," he whispered. "Forgive me for my ignorance." Anne, still not fully understanding, returned the hug hesitantly. "It's okay, Paul," she said softly. "You're helping us now." Anne's words, in all their innocence and sincerity, only increased Paul's resolve. He pulled back gently, holding the girl by her shoulders and looking her in the eyes. "Anne," he said, his voice firm despite the emotion in it, "I want to take care of you and the twins. Permanently. Would you like that?" Anne's eyes widened in surprise. You want to be our dad?" Paul felt his heart skip a beat at the word dad. It was something he had never considered before, but now it felt so right, so natural. "Yes," he replied, surprising himself with his certainty. "If you'll have me, I would very much like to be your father." Anne was silent for a long moment, her eyes flicking between Paul and the sleeping twins. Finally, she spoke, her voice small but resolute. "I think Mommy would like that. She always said she wanted us to have a family." Paul felt a wave of emotion wash over him. He pulled Anne in for another hug, this time more gentle, more full of promise. "Thank you, Anne," he whispered. "I promise I'll do my best to be a good dad to you all." In the days that followed, Paul threw himself into his new mission. He spent hours on the phone with lawyers, discussing the legal steps needed to gain custody of the children. The conversations were long and sometimes frustrating, packed with legal jargon and potential hurdles, but Paul was determined to overcome any obstacle. Anne watched these changes with a mix of curiosity and confusion. She noticed how Paul seemed more stressed, always on the phone or taking notes. Sometimes she caught him looking at her and the twins with an expression she couldn't decipher, a mixture of love, fear, and determination. "Paul," she asked one afternoon as he hung up from another call, "are you okay? You seem different." Paul smiled and pulling Anne close. "I'm okay, sweetheart. I'm just working hard to make sure we can stay together as a family." Meanwhile, Paul also began adapting his mansion to welcome the children. He hired decorators to turn empty rooms into comfortable spaces for kids, bought cribs and toys, and even started researching the best schools in the area for Anne. One afternoon, while the twins were napping peacefully in their cribs, Paul decided to take Anne to see the mansion. He wanted her to feel like part of the process, to understand that this would be her new home. When they arrived at the enormous house, Anne stared wide-eyed. Her gaze took in the tall windows, the well-maintained gardens, the imposing entrance. "It's so big," she whispered, almost in awe. Paul smiled kindly. "It's way too big for just one person," he said, "but it'll be perfect for a family." He guided Anne through the house, showing her the rooms being prepared for them. There was a huge space that would become an indoor play area for the twins, with brightly colored walls and baby-safe toys. Finally, they arrived at a hallway lined with doors. Paul stopped, turning to Anne with a smile. "These are the bedrooms," he explained. "Would you like to choose yours?" Anne's eyes went wide with surprise. "I can choose?" Paul nodded, his heart warming at the wonder on the girl's face. "Of course you can. This is your home, Anne. I want you to feel comfortable here." Anne hesitated for a moment before timidly walking down the hallway. She opened each door, peeking into the rooms with a mixture of curiosity and awe. Finally, she stopped in front of a room at the end of the hall. It was a spacious room with large windows overlooking the garden. "This one," she said quietly. "Can I have this one?" Paul beamed. "Of course, sweetheart, it's yours." Anne stepped into the room, spinning slowly to take everything in. Her eyes shone with a mix of emotions, excitement, a little fear, and something that looked very much like hope. "What do you think?" Paul asked, watching her carefully. "We can decorate it any way you like." Anne looked at him, a small smile beginning to form on her lips. "Could I have a bookshelf? Mommy always said that when we had a big house, I'd have a bookshelf full of books." Paul felt his heart tighten at the simplicity of her request. "Of course, Anne. We'll get you the biggest and best bookshelf you've ever seen." In that moment, watching Anne in her new room, Paul was overwhelmed by the reality of what he was doing. He wasn't just offering them a roof, he was giving these children a home, a chance to fulfill the dreams their mother had for them. Back at the hospital, Paul noticed another subtle change in the twins. They seemed more alert, more responsive. Whenever he approached their cribs, their tiny faces lit up with toothless smiles. "They like you," Anne commented one afternoon. Observing the interaction, Paul felt his heart flood with love. "And I love them," he answered softly. "I love all of you." As the days passed, Paul found himself more immersed in plans for the future. He pictured birthdays, first days of school, family vacations. Each new plan, each new dream made him feel more connected to these children, more determined to be the father they deserved. One night, as Anne slept and the twins rested peacefully in their cribs, Paul allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. He thought of the woman he had never met, Anne and the twins' mother. He thought of her dreams for her children, her love and her sacrifice. "I promise," he whispered into the silent room. "I promise I'll take care of them. I'll give them all the opportunities you dreamed of. I'll love them like they were my own." And in that moment, Paul knew his life had changed forever. He was no longer just Paul Dumont, the successful businessman. He was Paul, the potential father to 3 wonderful children. And for the first time in a long while, he felt truly complete. The day dawned like any other at the hospital. Paul arrived early with coffee and donuts for Anne, determined to keep spirits high as they waited for the twins' final discharge. The room was quiet, the babies still sleeping peacefully while Anne flipped idly through one of the books Paul had brought. That was when it happened. The door burst open and a woman walked into the room, her eyes scanning the place before settling on Anne. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Anne looked at the newcomer with a mix of confusion and apprehension. The woman was a stranger, but something about her features was strangely familiar, though Anne couldn't place it. "Anne," the woman's voice was gentle, almost reverent. "Oh my God, you look so much like Sarah." Paul instantly stood, placing himself protectively between Anne and the stranger. "Excuse me, but who are you?" he asked, his voice firm but polite. The woman seemed to realize the situation, blushing slightly. "I'm sorry, I'm Claire Moreau, Sarah's sister and these children's aunt." The room fell silent for a moment, the tension palpable in the air. Anne clung to Paul's sleeve, her eyes wide with both fear and confusion. Paul took a deep breath, trying to process the information. "Ms. Moreau, I'm Paul Dumont. I've been taking care of Anne and the twins since I found them." Claire nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving Anne. "I know. I saw the news. Did some digging. It took me so long to get here. I'm so sorry, Anne. I should have been here sooner." Anne, still gripping Paul's arm, finally spoke, her voice small and hesitant. You knew my mommy." Claire's features softened, a sad smile forming on her lips. "Yes, sweetheart. She was my younger sister. We lost touch a few years ago, but when I saw the reports about you, I knew I had to come." Paul could feel Anne trembling at his side. He laid a reassuring hand on her shoulder before turning back to Claire. "Miss Moreau, I understand this must be very emotional for you, but maybe we could discuss this outside for a moment. Anne's been through a lot and—" He was cut off by the sudden crying of one of the twins. Everyone turned toward the cribs, where the boy had woken up and seemed upset. Paul instinctively moved to pick him up, but paused, glancing at Claire. She hesitated a moment before motioning for him to continue. As Paul soothed the baby, Claire watched intently. She couldn't deny the care and kindness with which he treated the child. "Mr. Dumont," Claire began, her voice gentler now, "I appreciate everything you've done for these children, truly, but they're my family. I came to take them home." Claire's words dropped like a bomb in the room. Anne let out a small sound of distress, clinging even tighter to Paul. Paul felt his heart constrict. He had known this moment might come, but he wasn't prepared for the pain he felt at hearing Claire's announcement. Still, he forced himself to remain calm, knowing he had to be strong for Anne and the twins. "Miss Moreau," he began carefully, still cradling the baby, "I understand your position, but this is a huge decision. These children have been through tremendous trauma. Anne barely knows you, and the twins, well, they're still so small and fragile." Claire frowned, a spark of frustration in her eyes. "Mr. Dumont, I appreciate your concern, but I'm the only family these children have. It's my responsibility to care for them now." Anne, who had stayed silent until then, suddenly spoke, her voice trembling. "I don't want to go. Paul is our family now." The silence that followed was heavy, laden with emotion. Claire seemed shocked by Anne's words, while Paul fought to contain his own feelings. Just then, Dr. Martinez walked in, immediately sensing the tension. "What's going on here?" he asked, moving quickly to check on the babies. Paul briefly explained the situation while Dr. Martinez examined the twins. The doctor frowned, noticing the baby's vitals had shifted. "Folks," he said firmly, "I know this is a delicate situation, but these children's health must be our priority. They're showing signs of stress, likely due to all this tension in the room. I need everyone to remain calm, or I'll have to ask you to step out." The doctor's words seemed to bring everyone back to reality. Claire retreated a bit, guilt evident on her face. Paul nodded, focusing on calming the baby in his arms. "Dr. Martinez," Paul said calmly, "what can we do to help the twins right now?" The doctor gave Paul a grateful look. "For now, we need to keep them calm and comfortable. If you can stay with them, speak softly, maybe sing, that can work wonders." Claire took a hesitant step forward. Can I help in some way?" Dr. Martinez nodded. "Absolutely. The more love and care these babies receive, the better. But remember, no arguments or raised voices around them." With that, the doctor left the room, leaving the adults in an uncomfortable silence. Anne was still clinging to Paul, eyeing Claire warily. Paul was the first to break the silence. "Miss Moreau, Claire, I know this situation is hard for all of us, but what matters now are the children. Can we try to work together for their sake?" Claire hesitated for a moment before slowly nodding. "You're right, Mr. Dumont. The children come first." In the hours that followed, an uneasy truce settled over the room. Paul and Claire took turns caring for the twins, while Anne watched it all with apprehensive, vigilant eyes. During one of these shifts, Paul and Claire finally had the chance to really talk. Anne had dozed off in her chair, worn out by the stress, and the babies were finally sleeping peacefully. "Mr. Dumont," Claire began tentatively, I want to apologize for barging in the way I did earlier. It was impulsive and insensitive." Paul nodded, appreciating her honesty. "I understand, Ms. Moreau. It's an emotional situation for all of us." Claire gave a sad smile. "Please, call me Claire. And you're right, it is emotional. When I saw the news about the accident, about these kids being alone, I felt so guilty. Sarah and we hadn't spoken in years." Paul listened intently, seeing the pain in Claire's eyes. "May I ask what happened?" he inquired gently. Claire let out a deep sigh. "It's a long story. Sarah was always the rebel in the family. When she got pregnant with Anne, so young and unmarried, our family didn't handle it well. There were fights, ultimatums. In the end, Sarah chose her daughter above all else. She cut ties with us." Paul felt his heart ache at the thought of Sarah, alone and pregnant, facing the world for her child. "That must have been hard for everyone," he commented. Claire nodded, tears shining in her eyes. "It was... I should have done more. I should have supported my sister. But I was young and foolish, too worried about what others would think. By the time I realized my mistake, it was too late. Sarah wanted nothing to do with us anymore." Silence fell between them for a moment, heavy with unspoken regrets and what-ifs. "Claire," Paul said carefully, "I understand your desire to take care of these children now, but you have to understand they've been through so much trauma. Anne hardly knows you, and the twin, they're so tiny and vulnerable." Claire nodded slowly. "I know, and I can see how Anne has bonded with you. It's obvious you care deeply for them." Paul smiled softly, looking at the sleeping children. "More than I ever thought possible. They changed my life, Claire." Claire studied him for a long moment. "Tell me," she finally said, "how did you find them that night?" Paul took a deep breath and began to recount the story. He told her about the snowy evening, how he spotted Anne on the sidewalk, the fear and determination in the girl's eyes. He described the harrowing days in the ICU, the nights of keeping watch, the tiny milestones that felt miraculous. Claire listened, her eyes welling with tears as the story unfolded. When Paul finished, she was silent for a moment. "You know," she began softly, "Sarah was always a fighter. It seems she passed that on to Anne." Paul smiled. "Yes, Anne is incredibly strong. She told me a bit about Sarah. She sounded like an amazing woman." Claire smiled sadly. "She was and she would have been so grateful for everything you've done for her kids." Another silence fell, but this time it was more comfortable, filled with mutual understanding. "Paul," Claire finally began, using his first name for the first time, "I know you care deeply for these children, and it's obvious Anne trusts you. But you have to understand, I'm the only blood family they have left." Paul nodded slowly. "I understand that, Claire. But I also have to think about what's best for them. Anne has been through unimaginable trauma. She lost her mother, almost lost her siblings. Taking her away from everything familiar could be devastating." Claire frowned, clearly wrestling with her emotions. "But what about knowing her family, her heritage? Isn't that important for them too?" Paul thought for a moment before answering, "Yes, I think it's very important, but maybe it doesn't have to be an either-or situation. Maybe we can give these children the best of both worlds." Claire looked at him curiously. "What do you mean?" Paul leaned forward, his eyes shining with an idea. "What if we work together? You could be a big part of their lives, bringing the family connection they need, and I could continue to provide the stability and care they've become used to." Claire seemed to consider the idea for a moment. That could work. "But how exactly would we do that?" Paul smiled. "Well, for starters, I was planning on buying a bigger house to accommodate the children. We could find something with enough space for you as well, if you'd like. Or, if you'd prefer your own place, we could set up regular visits, maybe even extended stays." Claire looked surprised by the offer. "That's very generous of you, Paul, but you barely know me. How can you trust me like that?" Paul glanced over at Anne and the twins, a soft smile on his face. "Because these children matter most right now, and they deserve to have all the family and love they can get in their lives." Just then, Anne began stirring in her chair, her eyes slowly opening. She looked around, a small smile forming when she saw Paul and Claire conversing amicably. "You're not arguing anymore," she said drowsily. Paul and Claire exchanged guilty looks. "No, sweetheart," Claire replied. "We were just talking about what's best for you and your brothers." Anne sat up, suddenly alert. "What did you decide?" Paul knelt beside her, taking her small hand in his. "Anne, do you remember when we talked about family? How family isn't always just about blood?" Anne nodded slowly, her eyes shifting between Paul and Claire. Paul continued gently. "Well, Claire, here is your aunt. She's your mom's sister. And she traveled a long way because she cares about you and your brothers." Anne looked at Claire with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. You knew my mommy?" Claire approached cautiously, kneeling beside Paul. "Yes, sweetheart. Your mom was my baby sister. And even though we lost touch for a while, I always cared about her. And now, I really want to care for you and your brothers too." Anne was quiet for a moment, processing this. Finally, she looked at Paul, fear in her eyes. "But what about you, Paul? You're still going to be with us, right?" Paul's heart overflowed with love for this little girl who had become so important to him. "Of course I will, Anne. If you want me, I'll always be here for you and your brothers," Claire added softly. "Actually, Anne, Paul and I were discussing the idea of all of us staying together, like one big family." Anne's eyes widened with surprise and a trace of hope. "Really, all of us?" Paul nodded, smiling gently. "Yes, sweetheart. If that's okay with you, of course. How would you feel about having both me and your Aunt Claire in your life?" Anne was quiet for a moment, her little face creased in thought. Finally, she turned to Claire. "Will you tell me stories about Mommy?" Claire felt tears forming in her eyes. "Of course I will, sweetheart. I have so many stories to share with you about when your mum and I were kids." Anne then turned to Paul. "And you'll still take us to that big house you promised?" Paul laughed softly. "Yes, Anne. Actually, we were thinking we might find a place big enough for all of us." Anne seemed to ponder that for a moment before giving a small smile. "I think I'd like that." Just then, one of the twins began to whimper. Paul stood to check on them, but paused and looking at Claire. "Would you like to pick him up?" he offered. Claire hesitated for a moment before nodding, stepping up to the crib. Gently, she picked up the baby, tears filling her eyes as she held her nephew for the first time. "Hello, little one," she whispered. Paul watched the scene with mixed emotions. Part of him still felt a twinge of pain at the thought of sharing these children who had become so precious to him, but he knew it was best for them. They deserved as much love and family as possible. "You know," Paul said softly, "we still have a lot to figure out. Legal issues, logistics." Claire nodded, still rocking the baby. "Yes, it's going to be complicated, but I think it'll be worth it, don't you?" Paul smiled, glancing at Anne, who was watching everything with curious eyes. "Definitely worth it." The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Paul and Claire worked together to navigate the complex legal challenges of caring for the children. They consulted lawyers, talked to social workers, and began the process of finding a house large enough for their unconventional family. Anne, meanwhile, slowly started to open up to Claire. She loved hearing stories about her mother's childhood, and over time, she began to see Claire as a precious link to the mother she'd lost. The twins, oblivious to all the commotion around them, continued to grow and gain strength. They began to show more personality by the day, their smiles and coos bringing joy to everyone in the room. One afternoon, as Paul watched Claire reading a story to Anne, the twins peacefully sleeping in their cribs, he realized the magnitude of what they were building. It wasn't a traditional family, certainly. It was complicated, imperfect, and sometimes confusing. But it was filled with love, second chances, and hope for the future. "What are you thinking about?" Claire asked, noticing Paul's distant look. He smiled, looking at the children. "I'm thinking that life has a funny way of surprising us. A few weeks ago, I was just a lonely businessman. Now I have a family." Claire smiled back, understanding all too well. "It's funny how things work out, isn't it? I came here thinking I'd take these kids away, and now we're all planning a future together." Anne, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. "Does this mean we're a family now? All of us?" Paul and Claire exchanged glances before Paul answered, "Yes, Anne, I think we're a family now. A bit different maybe, but a family all the same." Anne grinned, a bright, genuine smile that lit up the whole room. "I like that," she said simply. At that moment, as the afternoon sunlight streamed through the hospital windows, filling the room with warmth and love, Paul knew they had made the right decision. The road ahead would be challenging, no doubt. There would be obstacles, adjustments, and likely many moments of doubt and uncertainty. But looking at Anne, the twins, and Claire, Paul felt a certainty he had never experienced before. This was his family now, imperfect, unexpected, but his. And together, they would face whatever the future brought. The morning sun lit up the conference room at Dumont Industries, where Paul was about to make an announcement that would change the course of his company, and he hoped the lives of many of his employees. He straightened his tie, took a deep breath, and entered the crowded room. The faces before him were a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Rumors about major changes had been circulating through the company for weeks, and everyone was eager to know what the future held. Paul stood at the front of the room, his gaze sweeping over the familiar and not so familiar faces. He saw top executives, mid-level managers, and, for the first time, representatives from the cleaning and maintenance staff. They were all there, united by the day's uncertainty. "Good morning, everyone," Paul began, his voice firm yet kind. "Over the past few weeks, I've gone through an experience that fundamentally changed my perspective on our company and our responsibility to our employees and the community." He paused, remembering Anne, the twins, and all the lessons they'd taught him. "Today, I'm here to announce a series of changes that I believe will not only benefit our company in the long run, but also make a real difference in the lives of our workers." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room, but Paul pressed on. "First, I'm implementing a significant pay raise for all our cleaning and maintenance staff. These men and women are the backbone of our company, keeping our facilities running smoothly, and it's time we properly recognize their value." There was some hesitant applause, mostly from the cleaning staff representatives. Paul saw tears in some of their eyes and felt his own heart tighten. "Furthermore," he continued, "we're establishing an education and healthcare fund for the children of all our employees. I believe that investing in our family's future is investing in our company's and our community's future." The applause grew louder, and Paul saw smiles spread across the room. He went on detailing more changes, better health benefits, more flexible work schedules, professional development programs. Each announcement was met with growing enthusiasm. When he finished, the room erupted in applause. Paul saw tears, smiles, and looks of gratitude. He knew these changes would cost the company a considerable sum, but for the first time in his career, he felt he was doing something genuinely worthwhile. After the meeting, as Paul headed back to his office, an older woman from the cleaning staff approached him. She had tears in her eyes as she took his hand. "Mr. Dumont," she said, her voice choked with emotion, "you have no idea what this means to us. My daughter, she's always dreamed of going to college, but I never thought it was possible. Now, with this education fund, thank you, sir, from the bottom of my heart." Paul felt tears threatening to spill from his own eyes. "You're welcome," he replied softly. "You deserve this, and more." As the woman walked away, Paul thought of Sarah, Anne's mother, who had worked so hard to give her children a better life. He hoped that, wherever she was, she approved of the changes he was making. In the weeks that followed, Paul worked tirelessly to implement the promised changes. He also prepared for a more personal transition, Anne and the twins leaving to live with Claire. On the day of the farewell, Paul organized a small gathering at his mansion. The once cold and impersonal house was now filled with warmth and love. Colorful balloons decorated the foyer, and a handmade banner by Anne read, "Thank you, Uncle Paul." When Claire arrived with the children, Paul felt his heart clench. Anne ran to hug him, and he lifted her up, holding her close. "I'll miss you, Paul," she whispered. "I'll miss you too, sweetheart," he replied, his voice breaking. "But remember, this isn't goodbye. I'll visit you often, and you're always welcome here." Claire approached, carrying the twins. "Paul," she said softly, "I can never thank you enough for everything you've done for these children." Paul shook his head. "No thanks needed. They've given me far more than I could ever repay." Anne then pulled away from Paul and retrieved something from her small backpack. It was the worn old blanket she had used to wrap the twins on that fateful snowy night. "I want you to keep this," she said, extending the blanket to Paul, "to remember us." Paul took the blanket with trembling hands, feeling the soft, worn fabric. "Oh, Anne," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "I could never forget you. You changed my life." He knelt down, looking into Anne's eyes. "I promise I'll always be there for you and your brothers. And I promise to keep working at the company to help other families, just like your mom would have." Anne smiled through her tears and hugged Paul again. When she pulled away, she looked at Claire, who nodded encouragingly. "It's time to go," Claire said quietly. Paul stood, feeling as though his heart was being torn from his chest, but he knew this was best for the children. They needed the stability and family connection Claire could provide. He watched Claire's car drive away, carrying the children who had become so important to him, with a mix of sadness and hope. Sadness for the emptiness he felt, but hope for the bright future he knew awaited them. Back in the now quiet mansion, Paul sat in his favorite armchair, the blanket from Anne in his hands. The tears he'd held back for so long finally came, and he cried for Anne, for the twins, for Sarah, and for all the families who struggled every day just to survive. But as he wept, Paul also felt a determination grow within him. He had been transformed by this experience, and he was committed to using that transformation to make a difference in the world. Months passed, and Paul kept his promise. He visited Anne and the twins regularly, delighting in every new milestone in their lives. The babies were growing strong and healthy, and Anne thrived under Claire's loving care. On one of those visits, Paul arrived at Claire's home wearing an excited grin. "I have news," he announced over dinner. Anne, now older and more confident, leaned forward curiously. "What kind of news, Uncle Paul?" Paul smiled. "Well, remember those changes we made at the company? The raise for the cleaning staff and the education fund." Claire and Anne nodded, and Paul continued. "Well, it's been a huge success. Our employees are happier and more productive than ever. And now, we're expanding the program." He explained how Dumont Industries was launching a new initiative to help struggling families in the community, establishing free learning centers, offering professional development courses, and providing medical assistance for those who couldn't afford it. "And you know what?" Paul said, his eyes bright. "All of this started because of you, because of your mother, Anne. She taught me through you what really matters in life." Anne smiled, her eyes filling with tears. "Mommy would be proud, wouldn't she, Aunt Claire?" Claire nodded, her own voice thick with emotion. "Yes, sweetheart. She would be very proud of all of us." As Paul looked at this family he now considered his own, he felt a surge of gratitude. His life had changed in ways he could never have imagined, all because of a chance encounter on a snowy night. And as dinner continued, filled with laughter and plans for the future, Paul knew this was only the beginning. A new beginning for him, for the children, and for all the lives they would touch together from now on. When evening fell and it was time for Paul to leave, he said his goodbyes to Claire and the children with warm embraces. Anne walked him to the door, holding his hand. "Uncle Paul, she said, looking at him with serious eyes. "Do you think someday I'll be able to help other people like you're doing?" Paul knelt to her eye level, his heart swelling with pride and love. "Anne, I'm absolutely certain you'll do amazing things to help others. In fact, you already are. You taught me so much, showed me how to be a better person. That's a very powerful way to help." Anne smiled, wrapping her arms around Paul's neck in a tight hug. "Thank you, Uncle Paul, for everything." Driving back home, Paul reflected on the incredible journey he'd taken in recent months. From a businessman focused solely on profits, he had become someone who saw real value in people and human connections. Arriving at his mansion, Paul didn't feel the emptiness that once haunted him. Instead, he felt a sense of purpose and determination. He looked at the old blanket Anne had given him, now carefully framed and hung in his office, a constant reminder of what truly mattered in life. Sitting at his desk, Paul began jotting down ideas for new programs and initiatives. He was eager to see what other positive changes he could bring to his company and community. Working late into the night, Paul smiled to himself. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be smooth. There would be challenges, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But he also knew he had found something far more valuable than any financial success: a purpose, a family, and a chance to make a real difference in the world. And so, with his heart full of gratitude and his eyes set on a bright future, Paul Dumont embraced his new beginning, one that promised not only to transform his own life, but the lives of countless others as well.